Agatha Christie The Big Four A Hercule Point Mr. Yon the guest I have met people who enjoy a channel crossing, men who can sit calmly in their deck chairs and, on arrival, wait until the boat is moored, then gather their belongings together without fuss and disembark. Personally, I can never manage this. From the moment I get on board I feel that the time is too short to settle down to anything. I move my suitcases from one spot to another, and if I go down to the saloon for a meal, I bolt my food with an uneasy feeling that the boat may arrive unexpectedly whilst I am below. Perhaps all this is merely a legacy from one's short leaves in the war, when it seemed a matter of such importance to secure a place near the gangway, and to be amongst the first to disembark lest one should waste precious minutes of one's or 5 days' leave. On this particular July morning, as I stood by the rail and watched the white cliffs of Dover drawing nearer, I marveled at the passengers who could sit calmly in their chairs and never even raise their eyes for the first sight of their native land. Yet perhaps their case was different from mine. Doubtless many of them had only crossed to Paris for the weekend, whereas I had spent the last year and a half on a ranch in the Argentine. I had prospered there, and my wife and I had both enjoyed the free and easy life of the South American continent. Nevertheless, it was with a lump in my that I watched the familiar shore draw nearer and nearer. I had landed in France 2 days before, transacted some necessary business, and was now en route for London. I should be there some months' time enough to look up old friends, and one old friend in particular. A little man with an egg-shaped head and green eyes, Hercule Poirot. I proposed to take him completely by surprise. My last letter from the Argentine had given no hint of my intended voyage. Indeed, that had been decided upon hurriedly as a result of certain business complications, and I spent many amused moments picturing to myself his delight and stupefaction on beholding me. He, Hercule, was not likely to be far from his headquarters. The time when his cases had drawn him from one end of England to the other was past. His fame had spread, and no longer would he allow one case to absorb all his time. He aimed more and more, as time went on, at being considered a consulting detective, as much a specialist as a Harley Street physician. He had always scoffed at the popular idea of the human bloodhound who assumed wonderful disguises to track criminals, and who paused at every footprint to measure it. "No, my friend Hastings," he would say, "we leave that to Giroux and his friends. Hercule Poirot's methods are his own. Order and method, and the little grey cells. Sitting at ease in our own armchairs we see the things that these others overlook, and we do not jump to the conclusion like the worthy Jap." No, there was little fear of finding Hercule Poirot far afield. On arrival in London, I'd posited my luggage at a hotel and drove straight on to the old address. Had poignant memories it brought back to me. I hardly waited to greet my old landlady, but hurried up the stairs 2 at a time and rapped on Poirot's door. "Enter, then," cried a familiar voice from within. I strode in. Poirot stood facing me. In his arms he carried a small valise, which he dropped with a crash on beholding me. "Mon ami, Hastings," he cried. "Mon ami, Hastings." And, rushing forward, he enveloped me in a capacious embrace. Our conversation was incoherent and inconsequent. Ejaculations, eager questions, inconfident answers, messages from my wife, explanations as to my journey, were all jumbled up together. "I suppose there's someone in my old rooms?" I asked at last, when we had calmed down somewhat. "I'd love to put up here again with you." Poirot's face changed with startling suddenness. "Mon Dieu! But what a chance épouvantable! Regard around you, my friend." For the first time I took note of my surroundings. Against the wall stood a vast ark of a trunk of prehistoric design. Near to it were placed a number of suitcases, ranged neatly in order of size from large to small. The inference was unmistakable. "You are going away?" "Yes." "Where to?" "South America." "What?" "Yes, it is a droll farce, is it not? It is to Rio I go, and every day I'll say to myself, I will write nothing in my letters but oh, the surprise of the good Hastings when he beholds me." "But when are you going?" Poirot looked at his watch. "In an hour's time." "I thought you always said nothing would induce you to make a long sea voyage." Poirot closed his eyes and shuddered. "Speak not of it to me, my friend. My doctor, he assures me that one dies not of it, and it is for the one time only, you understand, that never shall I return." He pushed me into a chair. "Come, I will tell you how it all came about. Do you know who is the richest man in the world? Richer even than Rockefeller? Abe Ryland. The American soap king." "Precisely. One of his secretaries approached me. There is some very considerable, as you would call it, hocus pocus going on in connection with a big conveni in Rio. He wished me to investigate matters on the spot. I rehearsed. I told him that if the facts were laid before me, I would give him my expert opinion. But that he professed himself unable to do. I was to be put in possession of the facts only on my arrival out there. Normally, that would have closed the matter. To dictate to Hercule Poirot is sheer impertinence. But the sum offered was so stupendous that for the first time in my life I was tempted by mere money. It was a cornpotence of fortune. And there was a second attraction, you, my friend. For this last year and a half I have been a very lonely old man. I thought to myself, why not? I am beginning to weary of this unending solving of foolish problems. I have achieved sufficient fame. Let me take this money and settle down somewhere near my old friend. I was quite affected by this token of Poirot's regard. So I accepted, he continued, and in an hour's time I must leave to catch the boat train. One of life's little ironies, is it not? But I will admit to you, Hastings, that had not the money offered been so big, I might have hesitated, for just lately I have begun a little investigation of my own. Tell me, what is commonly meant by the PLNASE, the Big Four? I suppose it had its origin at the Versailles Conference, and then there's the famous Big Four in the film world, and the term is used by hosts of smaller fry. I see, said Poirot thoughtfully. I have come across the phrase, you understand, under certain circumstances where none of those explanations would apply. It seems to refer to a gang of international criminals or something of that kind. Only what? I asked, as he hesitated. Only that I fancy that it is something on a large scale. Just a little idea of mine, nothing more. Ah, but I must complete my packing. The time advances. Don't go, I urged. Cancel your package and come out on the same boat with me. Poirot drew himself up and glanced at me reproachfully. Ah, is it that you don't understand? I have passed my word, you comprehend the word of Hercule Poirot. Nothing but a matter of life or death could detain me now. And that's not likely to occur, I murmured ruefully. Unless at the 11th hour the door opens and the unexpected guest comes in. I quoted the old saw with a SL@LT laugh, and then, in the pause that succeeded it, we both started as a sound came from the inner room. What's that? I cried. Ma foi, retorted Poirot. It sounds very like your unexpected guest in my bedroom. But how can anyone be in there? There's no door except into this room. Your memory is excellent, Hastings. Now for the deductions. The window. But it's a burglar, then. He must have had a stiff climb of it. Say it was almost impossible. I had risen to my feet and was striding in the direction of the door when the sound of fumbling at the handle from the other side arrested me. The door swung slowly open. Framed in the doorway stood a man. He was coated from head to foot with dust and mud, his face was thin and emaciated. He stared at us for a moment, and then swayed and fell. Poirot hurried to his side, then he looked up and spoke to brandy quickly. I dashed some brandy into a glass and brought it. Poirot managed to administer a little, and together we raised him and carried him to the couch. In a few minutes he opened his eyes and looked round him with an almost vacant stare. What is it you want, monsieur? Asked Poirot. The man opened his lips and spoke in a queer mechanical voice. Am Hercule Poirot, 14, Faraway Street. Yes, I am he. The man did not seem to understand, and merely repeated in exactly the same tone, Am Hercule Poirot, 14, Faraway Street. Poirot tried him with several questions. Sometimes the man did not answer at all, sometimes he repeated the same phrase. Poirot made a sign to me to ring up on the telephone. Get Dr. Ridgway to come round. The doctor was in, luckily, and as his house was only just round the corner, few minutes elapsed before he came bustling in. What's all this, eh? Poirot gave him a brief explanation, and the doctor started examining our strange visitor, who seemed quite unconscious of his presence or ours. Said Dr. Ridgway, when he had finished. Curious case. Brain fever, I suggested. The doctor immediately snorted with contempt. Brain fever. Brain fever. No such thing as brain fever. An invention of novelists. No, the man's had a shock of some kind. He's come here under the force of a persistent idea to find Hercule Poirot, 14 Faraway Street, and he repeats those words mechanically without in the least knowing what they mean. Aphasia, I said eagerly. This suggestion did not cause the doctor to snort quite as violently as my last one had done. He made no answer, but handed the man a sheet of paper and a pencil. Let's see what he'll do with that, he remarked. The man did nothing with it for some moments, then he suddenly began to write feverishly. With equal suddenness he stopped and let both paper and pencil fall to the ground. The doctor picked it up, and shook his head. Nothing here. Only the figure 4 scrawled a dozen times, each one bigger than the last. Wants to write 14, Faraway Street, I expect. It's an interesting case, very interesting. Can you possibly keep him here until this afternoon? I'm due at the hospital now, but I'll come back this afternoon and make all arrangements about him. It's too interesting a case to be lost sight of. I explained Poirot's departure and the fact that I proposed to accompany him to Sutharnton. That's all right. Leave the man here. He won't get into mischief. He's suffering from cornplat exhaustion. Will probably sleep for 8 hours on end. I'll have a word with that excellent Nears. Funny face of yours, and tell her to keep an eye on him. And Dr. Ridgway bustled out with his usual celerity. Poirot himself completed his packing, with one eye on the clock. The time, it marches with a rapidity unbelievable. Come now, Hastings, you cannot say that I have left you with nothing to do. A most sensational problem, the man from the unknown. Who is he? Is he? Ah, sapristi, but I would give 2 years of my life to have this boat go tomorrow instead of today. There is something here very curious, very interesting. But one must have time. It may be days or even months before he will be able to tell us what he came to tell. I'll do my best, Poirot, I assured him. I'll try to be an efficient substitute. Yes. His rejoinder struck me as being a shade doubtful. I picked up the sheet of paper. LFL, we're writing a story, I said lightly. I should weave this in with your latest idiosyncrasy and call it the Alice Terry of the Big Four. I tapped the penciled figures as I spoke. And then I started, for our invalid, roused suddenly from his stupor, sat up in his chair and said clearly and distinctly, Li Cheng Yen. He had the look of a man suddenly awakened from sleep. Poirot made a sign to me not to speak. The man went on. He spoke in a clear, high voice, and something in his enunciation made me feel that he was quoting from some written report or lecture. Li Cheng Yen may be regarded as representing the brains of the Big Four. He is the controlling and motive force. I have designated him, therefore, as number 1. Number 2 is seldom mentioned by name. He is represented by an S with 2 lines through it, the sign for $1, also by 2 stripes and a star. It may be conjectured, therefore, that he is an American subject, and that he represents the power of wealth. There seems no doubt that number 3 is a woman, and her nationality French. It is possible that she may be one of the sirens of the demi-monde, but nothing is imminent definitely. Number 4, his voice faltered and broke. Poirot leaned forward. Yes, he prompted eagerly, number 4. His eyes were fastened on the man's face. Some overmastering terror seemed to be gaining the day, the features were distorted and twisted. The destroyer, gasped the man. Then, with a final convulsed movement, he fell back in a dead faint. Mon Dieu, whispered Poirot, I was right then. I was right. He interrupted me. Carry him on to the bed in my room. I have not a minute to lose if I would catch my train. Not that I want to catch it, Oh, that I could miss it with a clear conscience. But I gave my word. Come, Hastings. Leaving our mysterious visitor in the charge of Mrs. Pearson, we drove away, and duly caught the train by the skin of our teeth. Poirot was alternately silent and loquacious. He would sit staring out of the window like a man lost in a dream, apparently not hearing a word that I said to him. Then, reverting to animation suddenly, he would shower injunctions and commands upon me, and urge the necessity of constant Marconigrams. We had a long fit of silence just after we passed Woking. The train, of course, did not stop anywhere until Southampton, but just here it happened to be held up by a signal. Ah! Sacre mille tonnerres, cried Poirot suddenly. But I have been an imbecile. I see clearly at last. It is undoubtedly the blessed saints who stopped the train. Jump, Hastings, but jump, I tell you. In an instant he had unfastened the carriage door, and jumped out on the line. Throw out the suitcases and jump yourself. I obeyed him just in time. As I alighted beside him, the train moved on, and now, Poirot, I said, in some exasperation, perhaps you will tell me what all this is about. It is, my friend, that I have seen the light. That, I said, is very illuminating to me. It should be, said Poirot, but I very much fear that it is not. If you can carry 2 of these valises, I think I can manage the rest. To the man from the asylum, fortunately the train had stopped near a station. A short walk brought us to a garage where we were able to obtain a car, and half an hour later we were spinning rapidly back to London. Then, and not till then, did Poirot deign to satisfy my curiosity. You do not see? No more did I. But I see now. Hastings, I was being got out of the way. What? Yes. Very cleverly. Both the place and the method were chosen with great knowledge and acumen. They were afraid of me. Who were? Those 4 geniuses who have banded themselves together to work outside the law. A Chinaman, an American, a Frenchwoman, and another. Pray the good God we arrive back in time, Hastings. You think there is danger to our visitor? I am sure of it. Nears. Pearson greeted us on arrival. Brushing aside her ecstasies of astonishment on beholding Poirot, we asked for information. It was reassuring. No one had called, and our guest had not made any sign. With a of relief we went up to the rooms. Poirot crossed the outer one and went to the inner one. Then he called me, his voice strangely agitated. Hastings, he's dead. I came running to join him. The man was lying as we had left him, but he was dead, and had been dead some time. I rushed out for a doctor. Ridgway, I knew, would not have returned yet. I found one almost immediately, and brought him back with me. He's dead right enough, poor chapter Tranve you've been befriending, eh? Something of the kind, said Poirot evasively. Hat was the cause of death, doctor. Hard to say. Fight have been some kind of it. There are signs of asphyxiation. No gas laid on, is there? No, electric light, nothing else. And both windows wide open, too. Been dead about 2 hours, I should say. You'll notify the proper people, won't you? He took his departure. Poirot did some necessary telephoning. Finally, somewhat to my surprise, he rang up our old friend Inspector Japp, and asked him if he could possibly come round. No sooner were these proceedings completed than Mrs. Pearson appeared, her eyes as round as saucers. There's a man here from the Ceylon, did you ever? Shall I show him up? We signified assent, and a big burly man in uniform was ushered in. Morning, gentlemen, he said cheerfully. I've got reason to believe you've got one of my birds here. Escaped last night, he did. He was here, said Poirot quietly. Not got away again, has he? Asked the keeper, with some concern. He is dead. The man looked more relieved than otherwise. You don't say so. Well, I dare say it's best for all parties. Was he dangerous? Homicidal, do you mean? Oh, no. Harmless enough. Persecution mania very acute. full of secret societies from China that had got him shut there all the same. I shuddered. "How long has he been shut up?" asked Poirot. "A matter of 2 years now." "I see," said Poirot quietly. It never occurred to anybody that he might be sane. The keeper permitted himself to laugh. If he was sane, what would he be doing in a lunatic asylum? "They all so they're sane, you know." Poirot said no more. He took the man in to see the body. The identification came immediately. "That's Enal at L," said the keeper callously, "finny sort of bloke, ain't he? Well, gentlemen, I had best go off now and make arrangements under the circumstances. We won't trouble you with the corpse much longer. If there's a inquest, you will have to appear at it, I dare say. Good morning, sir." With a rather uncouth bow he shambled out of the room. A few minutes later Japham arrived. The Scotland Yard inspector was jaunty and dapper as usual. "Here I am, Monsieur Poirot. What can I do for you? Thought you were off to the coral strands of somewhere or other today. My good Jap, I want to know if you have ever seen this man before." He led Jap into the bedroom. The inspector stared down at the figure on the bed with a puzzled face. "Let me see now, he seems sort of familiar and I pride myself on my memory, too. Why, God bless my soul, it's Mayerling. Secret Service chap, not one of our people. Went to Russia 5 years ago. Never heard of again. Always thought the Bullseyes had done him and it all fits in," said Poirot, when Jap had taken his leave, "except for the fact that he seems to have died a natural death." He stood looking down on the motionless figure with a dissatisfied frown. A puff of wind set the window curtains flying out, and he looked up sharply. "I suppose you opened the windows when you laid him down on the bed, Hastings?" "No, I didn't," I replied. "As far as I remember, they were shut." Poirot lifted his head suddenly. "Shut and now they are open. What can that mean?" "Somebody came in that way," I suggested. "Possibly," agreed Poirot, but he spoke absently and without conviction. After a minute or two he said, "That is not exactly the point I had in mind, Hastings. If only one window was open it would not intrigue me so much. It is both windows being open that strikes me as curious." He hurried into the other room. "The sitting room window is open, too. That also we left shut." "Ah." He bent over the dead man, examining the corners of the mouth minutely. Then he looked up suddenly. "He has been gagged, Hastings." "Gagged and then poisoned? Good heavens!" I exclaimed, shocked. "We shall find out all about it from the post-mortem." "We shall find out nothing. He was killed by inhaling strong prussic acid. It was jammed right under his nose. Then the murderer went away again, first opening all the windows. Hydrocyanic acid is exceedingly volatile, but it has a pronounced smell of bitter almonds. With no trace of the smell to guide them, and no suspicion of foul play, death would be put down to some natural cause by the doctors. So this man was in the Secret Service, Hastings. And 5 years ago he disappeared in Russia. The last 2 years he's been in the asylum," I said. "But what of the 3 years before?" Poirot shook his head, and then caught my arm. "The clock, Hastings, look at the clock." I followed his gaze to the mantelpiece. The clock had stopped at 4 o'clock. "Mon ami, someone has tampered with it. It had still 3 days to run. It is an 8-day clock, you comprehend. But what should they want to do that for? Some idea of a false scent by making the crime appear to have taken place at 4 o'clock. No, no, rearrange your ideas, mon amount, exercise your little grey cells. You are Mayerling. You hear something perhaps and you know well enough that your doom is sealed. You have just time to leave a sign. 4 o'clock, Hastings. Number 4, the destroyer. Ah! An idea." He rushed into the other room and seized the telephone. He asked for Hanwell. "You are the asylum, yes? I understand there has been an escape today? What is that you say? A little moment, if you please. Will you repeat that? Ah. Parfaitement." He hung up the receiver, and turned to me. "You heard, Hastings? There has been no escape. But the man who came the keeper? I said. I very much wonder. You mean number 4, the destroyer? I gazed at Poirot dumbfounded. A minute or two after, on recovering my voice, I said, we shall emo him again, anywhere, that's one thing. He was a man of very pronounced personality. Was he, mon ami? I think not. He was burly and bluff and red-faced, with a thick mustache and a hoarse voice. He will be none of those things by this time, and for the rest, he has nondescript eyes, nondescript ears, and a perfect set of false teeth. Identification is not such an easy matter as you seem to think. Next time you think there will be a next time. Poirot's face grew very grave. It is a duel to the death, mon amt. You and I on the one side, the big 4 on the other. They have won the first trick, but they have failed in their plan to get me out of the way, and in the future they have to reckon with Hercule Poirot. 3. Hear more about LL Yen. For a day or two after our visit from the fake asylum attendant, I was in some hopes that he might return, and I refused to leave the flat even for a moment. As far as I could see, he had no reason to suspect that we had penetrated his disguise. He might, I thought, return en fright to remove the body, but Poirot scoffed at my reasoning. Mon ami, he said, if you wish you may wait in to put salt on the little bird's tail, but for me I do not waste my time so. Well, then, Poirot, I argued, why did he run the risk of coming at all? If he intended to return later for the body, I can see some point in his visit. He would at least be removing the evidence against himself. As it is, he does not seem to have gained anything. Poirot shrugged his most Gallic shrug. But you do not see with the eyes of number 4, Hastings, he said. You talk of evidence, but what evidence have we against him? True, we have a body, but we have no proof even that the man was murdered. Prussic acid, when inhaled, leaves no trace. Again, we can find no one who saw anyone enter the flat during our absence, and we have found out nothing about the movements of our late friend, Mayerling. No, Hastings, number 4 has left no trace, and he knows it. His visit we may call a reconnaissance. Perhaps he wanted to make quite sure that Mayerling was dead, but more likely, I think, he came to see Hercule Poirot, and to have speech with the adversary whom alone he must fear. Poirot's reasoning appeared to be typically egotistical, but I forbore to argue. And what about the inquest? I asked. I suppose you will explain things clearly there, and let the police have a full description of number 4. And to what end? Can we produce anything to impress a coroner's jury of your solid Britishers? Is our description of number 4 of any value? No, we shall allow them to call it accidental death, and maybe, although I have not much hope, our clever murderer will pat himself on the back that he deceived Hercule Poirot in the first round. Poirot was right as usual. We saw no more of the man from the asylum and the inquest, at which I gave evidence, but which Poirot did not even attend, aroused no public interest. As, in view of his intended trip to South America, Poirot had wound up his affairs before my arrival, he had at this time no cases in hand, but although he spent most of his time in the flat I could get little out of him. He remained buried in an armchair, and discouraged my attempts at conversation. And then one morning, about a week after the murder, he asked me if I would care to accompany him on a visit he wished to make. I was pleased, for I felt he was making a mistake in trying to work things out so entirely on his own, and I wished to discuss the case with him. But I found he was not communicative. Even when I asked where we were going, he would not answer. Poirot loves being mysterious. He will never part with a piece of information until the last possible moment. In this instance, having taken successively a bus and 2 trains, and arrived in the neighborhood of one of London's most depressing southern suburbs, he consented at last to explain matters. We go, Hastings, to see the one man in England who knows most of the underground life of China. Indeed. Who is he? A man you have never heard of, a Mr. John Inglis. To all intents and purposes, he is a retired civil servant of mediocre intellect, with a house full of Chinese curios with which he bores his friends and acquaintances. Nevertheless, I am assured by those who should know that the only man capable of giving me the information I seek is this same John Ingles. A few moments more saw us ascending the steps of the Laurels, as Nfr Ingles's residence was called. Personally, I did not notice a laurel bush of any kind, so deduced that it had been named according to the usual obscure nomenclature of the suburbs. We were admitted by an impassive-faced Chinese servant and ushered into the presence of his master. Near Ingles was a squarely built man, somewhat yellow of countenance, with deep-set eyes that were oddly reflective in character. He rose to greet us, setting aside an open letter which he had held in his hand. He referred to it after his greeting. "Sit down, won't you? Hasley tells me that you want some information and that I may be useful to you in the matter." "That is so, monsieur. I ask of you if you have any knowledge of a man named Li Changyan." "That's rum, very rum indeed. How did you come to hear about the man? You know him, then?" "I've met him once. And I know something of him, not quite as much as I should like to. But it surprises me that anyone else in England should even have heard of him. He's a great man in his way, Mandarin class and all that, you know, but that's not the crux of the matter. There's good reason to suppose that he's the man behind it all." "Behind what?" "Everything. The worldwide unrest, the labor troubles that beset every nation, and the revolutions that break out in some. There are people, not scaremongers, who know what they are talking about, and they say that there is a force behind the scenes which aims at nothing less than the disintegration of civilization. In Russia, you know, there were many signs that Lenin and Trotsky were mere puppets whose every action was dictated by another's brain. I have no definite proof that would count with you, but I am quite convinced that this brain was Li Changyan's." "Oh, come," I protested, "isn't that a bit far-fetched? How would a Chinaman cut any ice in Russia?" Poirot frowned at me irritably. "For you, Hastings," he said, "everything is far-fetched that comes not from your own imagination. For me, I agree with this gentleman. But continue, I pray, monsieur. What exactly he hopes to get out of it all I cannot pretend to say for certain," went on Mr. Ingles, "but I assume his disease is one that has attacked great brains from the time of Akbar and Alexander to Napoleon, a lust for power and personal supremacy. Up to modern times armed force was necessary for conquest, but in this century of unrest a man like Li Changyan can use other means. I have evidence that he has unlimited money behind him for bribery and propaganda, and there are signs that he controls some scientific force more powerful than the world has dreamed of." Poirot was following Mr. Ingles's words with the closest attention. "And in China?" he asked. "He moves there too?" The other nodded in emphatic assent. "There," he said, "Alth 01 at 11 can produce no proof that would count in a court of law. I speak from my own knowledge. I know personally every man who counts for anything in China today, and this I can tell you, the men who loom most largely in the public eye are men of little or no personality. They are marionettes who dance to the wires pulled by a master hand, and that hand is Li Changyan's. His is the controlling brain of the East today. We don't understand the East, we never shall, but Li Changyan is its moving spirit. Not that he comes out into the limelight, oh, not at all, he never moves from his palace in Peking. But he pulls strings that it, pulls strings and things happen far away." "And there is no one to oppose him?" asked Poirot. "Near." Ingles leaned forward in his chair. "4 men have tried in the last few years," he said slowly, "men of character, and honesty, and brain power. Any one of them might in time have interfered with his plans." He paused. "Well?" one queried. "Well, they are dead. One told an article, and mentioned Li Changyan's name in connection with the riots in Peking, and within 2 days he was stabbed in the street. His murderer was never caught. The offenses of the other 2 were similar. In a speech or an article, or in conversation, each linked Li Changyan's name with rioting or revolution, and within a week of his indiscretion each was dead. One was poisoned, one died of cholera, an isolated case not part of an epidemic, and one was found dead in his bed. The cause of the last death was never determined, but I was told by a doctor who saw the corpse that it was burnt and shriveled as though a wave of electrical energy of incredible power had passed it. And Li Changyan? Inquired Poirot. Naturally nothing is traced to Hira, but there are signs. Near. Ingles shrugged. Oh, signs, yes, certainly. And once I found a man who would talk, a brilliant young Chinese chemist who was a protégé of Li Changyan's. He came to me one day, this chemist, and I could see that he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He hinted to me of experiments on which he'd been engaged in Li Changyan's palace under the Mandarin's direction, experiments on coolies in which the most revolting disregard for human life and suffering had been shown. His nerve had completely broken, and he was in the most pitiable state of terror. I put him to bed in a top room off me own house, intending to question him the next day, and that, of course, was of me. How did they get him? Demanded Poirot. That I shall never know. I woke that night to find my house in flames, and was lucky to escape with my life. Investigation showed that a fire of amazing intensity had broken out on the top floor, and the remains of my young chemist friend were charred to a cinder. I could see from the earnestness with which he had been speaking that Mr. Ingles was a man mounted on his hobby horse, and evidently he, too, realized that he had been carried away, for he laughed apologetically. But, of course, he said, I have no proofs, and you, like the others, will merely tell me that I have a bee in my bonnet. On the contrary, said Poirot quietly, we have every reason to believe your story. We ourselves are more than a little interested in Li Changyan. Very odd your mowing about him. Didn't fancy a soul in England had ever heard of him. I'd rather like to know how you did come to hear of him, if it's not indiscreet. Not in the least, monsieur. A man took refuge in my rooms. He was suffering badly from shock, but he managed to tell us enough to interest us in this Li Changyan. He described 4 people, the big foreign organization hitherto undreamed of. Number 1 is Li Changyan, number 2 is an unknown American, number 3 an equally unknown Frenchwoman, number 4 may be called the executive of the organization, the destroyer. My informant died. Tell me, monsieur, is that place known to you at all? The big 4. Not in connection with Li Changyan. No, I can't say it is. But I've heard it, or read it, just lately, and in some unusual connection too. Ah, I've got it. He rose and went across to an inlaid lacquer cabinet, an exquisite thing, as even I could see. He returned with a letter in his hand. Here you are. Note from an old seafaring man I ran against once in Shanghai. Hoary old reprobate, maudlin with drink by now, I should say. I took this to be the ravings of alcoholism. He read it aloud. Dear sir, you may not remember me, but you did me a good turn once in Shanghai. Do me another now. I must have money to get out of the country. I'm well hit here, I hope, but any day they may get me. The big 4, I mean. It's life or death. I've plenty of money, but I daren't get at it, for fear of putting them wise. Send me a couple of hundred in notes. I'll repay it faithful, I swear to that. Your servant, sir, Jonathan Wally, dated from Granite Bungalow, Hop Aden, Dartmoor. I'm afraid I regarded it as rather a crude method of relieving me of a couple of hundred which I can ill spare. If it's any use to you, he held it out. Je vous remercie, monsieur. I start for Hop Aden meme. Dear me, this is very interesting. Supposing I came along too? Any objection? I should be charmed to have your company, but we must start at once. We shall not reach Dartmoor until close on nightfall, as it is. John Ingles did not delay us more than a couple of minutes, and soon we were in the train moving out of Paddington bound for the West Country. Hop Aden was a small village clustering in a hollow right on the fringe of the moorland. It was reached by a 9-mile drive from Moreton-Hampstead. It was about 8 o'clock when we arrived, but as the month was July, the daylight was still abundant. We drove into the narrow street of the village and then stopped to ask our way of an old rustic. Granite Bungalow, said the old man reflectively, it be Granite Bungalow you do want? We assured him that this was what we did want. The old man pointed to a small grey cottage at the end of the street. There be T Bungalow. "Do ye want to see Teal Inspector?" "What inspector?" asked Poirot sharply. "What do you mean? Haven't ye heard about tea murder, then? A shocking business tea was seemingly. Pools of blood, they do say." "Mon Dieu," murmured Poirot. "This inspector of U.S., I must see him at once." 5 minutes later we were closeted with Inspector Meadows. The inspector was inclined to be stiff at first, but at the magic name of Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard he unbent. "Yes, sir, murdered this morning. A shocking business. They phoned to Moreton, and I came out at once. Looked a mysterious thing to begin with. The old man, he was about 70, and fond of his glass. From all I hear was lying on the floor of the living room. There was a bruise on his head and his was cut from ear to ear. Blood all over the place, as you can understand. The woman who cooks for him, Betsy Andrews, she told us that her master had several little Chinese jade figures, that he'd told her were very valuable, and these had disappeared. That, of course, looked like assault and robbery, but there were all sorts of difficulties in the way of that solution. The old fellow had 2 people in the house, Betsy Andrews, who is a hop-addin' woman, and a rough kind of manservant, Robert Grant. Grant had gone to the farm to fetch the milk, which he does every day, and Betsy had stepped out to have a chat with a neighbor. She was only away 20 minutes between 10 and half past, and the crime must have been done then. Grant returned to the house first. He went in by the back door, which was open. No one locks up doors round here, not in broad daylight, at all events. Put the milk in the larder, and went into his own room to read the paper and have a smoke. He had no idea anything unusual had occurred, at least, that's what he says. Then Betsy comes in, goes into the living room, sees what's happened, and lets out a screech to wake the dead. That's all fair and square. Someone got in whilst those 2 were out, and did the old man in, but it struck me at once that he must be a pretty cool customer. He'd have to come right up the village street, or creep someone's backyard. Granite Bungalow has got houses all round it, as you can see. How was it that no one had seen him?" The inspector paused with a flourish. "Aha, I perceive your point," said Poirot. "To continue. Well, sir, fishy, I said to myself, fishy. And I began to look about me. Those jade figures, now. Would a common tramp ever suspect that they were valuable? Anyway, it was madness to fry such a thing in broad daylight. Suppose the old man had yelled for help?" "I suppose, Inspector," said Mr. Inglis, "that the bruise on the head was inflicted before death." "Quite right, sir. First knocked him silly, the murderer did, and then cut his throat. That's clear enough. But how the dickens did he come or go? They notice strangers quick in at in a little place like this. It came to me all at once nobody did come. I took a good look round. It had rained the night before, and there were footprints clear enough going in and out of the kitchen. In the living room there were 2 sets of footprints only. Betsy Andrews' stopped at the door, Mr. Wally's, he was wearing carpet slippers, and another man's. The other man had stepped in the blood stains, and I traced his bloody footprints." "I beg your pardon, sir." "Not at all," said Near Inglis, with a faint smile, "the adjective is perfectly understood. I traced them to the kitchen but not beyond. Point number 1. On the lintel of Robert Grant's door was a faint smear of blood. That's point number 2. Point number 3 was when I got hold of Grant's boots, which he had taken off, and fitted them to the marks. That settled it. It was an inside job. I warned Grant and took him into custody, and what do you think I found packed away in his portmanteau? The little jade figures and a ticket of leave. Robert Grant was also Abraham Biggs, convicted for felony and housebreaking 5 years ago." The inspector paused triumphantly. "What do you think of that, gentlemen?" "I think," said Poirot, "that it appears a very clear case of a surprising clearness. In fact, this Bias, or Grant, he must be a man very foolish and uneducated, eh? Oh, he is that a roll at common sort of fellow. No idea of what a footprint may clearly he reads not the detective fiction. Well, Inspector, I congratulate you. We may look at the scene of the crime." "Yes. I'll take you there myself this minute. I'd like you to see those footprints. I, too, should like to see them. Yes, yes, very interesting, very ingenious. We set out forthwith. Near Ingles and the inspector forged ahead. I drew Poirot back a little so as to be able to speak to him out of the inspector's hearing. What do you really think, Poirot? Is there more in this than meets the eye? That is just the question. Mon Mount Wally says plainly enough in his letter that the Big Four are on his track, and we know, you and I, that the Big Four is no bogey for the children. Yet everything seems to say that this man Grant committed the crime. Why did he do so? For the sake of the little jade figures? Or is he an agent of the Big Four? I confess that this last seems more likely. However valuable the jade, a man of that class was not likely to realize the fact at any rate, not to the point of committing murder for them, that, par example, ought to have struck the inspector. He could have stolen the jade and made off with it instead of committing a brutal murder. Ah, yes, I fear our Devonshire friend has not used his little grey cells. He has measured footprints, and has omitted to reflect and arrange his ideas with the necessary order and method. For the importance of a leg of mutton, the inspector drew a key from his pocket and unlocked the door of Granite Bungalow. The day had been fine and dry, so our feet were not likely to leave any prints. Nevertheless, we wiped them carefully on the mat before entering. A woman came up out of the gloom and spoke to the inspector, and he turned aside. Then he spoke over his shoulder. Have a good look round, near Poirot, and see all there is to be seen. I'll be back in about 10 minutes. By the way, here's Grant's boot. I brought it along with me for you to compare the impressions. We went into the living room, and the sound of the inspector's footsteps died away outside. Ingles was attracted immediately by some Chinese curios on a table in the corner, and went over to examine them. He seemed to take no interest in Poirot's doings. I, on the other hand, watched him with breathless interest. The floor was covered with a dark green linoleum which was ideal for showing up footprints. A door at the farther end led into the small kitchen. From there another door led into the scullery, where the back door was situated, and another into the bedroom which had been occupied by Robert Grant. Having explored the ground, Poirot commented upon it in a low-running monologue. Here is where the body lay. That big dark stain and the splashes all around mark the spot. Traces of carpet slippers and number 9 boots, you observe, but all very conalesced. Then 2 sets of tracks leading to and from the kitchen. Whoever the murderer was, he came in that way. You have the boot, Hastings. Give it to me. He conv'd it carefully with the prints. Yes, both made by the same man, Robert Grant. He came in that way, killed the old man, and went back to the kitchen. He had stepped in the blood. See the stains he left as he went out. Nothing to be seen in the kitchen. All the village has been walking about in it. He went into his own room. No, first he went back again to the scene of the crime. Was that to get the little jade figures? Or had he forgotten something that might incriminate him? Perhaps he killed the old man the second time he went in. I suggested. Mais non, you do not observe. On one of the outgoing footmarks stained with blood there is superimposed an ingoing one. I wonder what he went back for the little jade figures as an afterthought? It is all, well, he has given himself away pretty hopelessly. Nsce pass by tell you, Hastings, it goes against reason, it offends my little grey cells. Let us go into his bedroom. Ah, yes, there is the smear of blood on the lintel and just a trace of Foutrenark's blood stained. Robert Grant's footmarks, and his only, near the body. Robert Grant the only man who went near the house. Yes, it must be so. What about the old woman? I said suddenly. She was in the house alone after Grant had gone for the milk. She might have killed him and then gone out. Her feet would leave no prints if she hadn't been outside. Very good, Hastings. I wondered whether that hypothesis would occur to you. I had already thought of it and rejected it. Betsy Andrews is a local woman, well known hereabouts. She can have no connection with the Big Four, and, besides, old Wally was a powerful fellow, by all accounts. This is a man's work, not a woman's. I suppose the Big Four couldn't have had some diabolical contrivance concealed in the ceiling, something which descended automatically and cut the old man's throat and was afterwards drawn up again. Like Jacob's ladder? I know, Hastings, that you have an imagination of the most fertile, but I implore of you to keep it within bounds. I subsided, abashed. Poirot continued to wander, poking into rooms and cupboards with a profoundly dissatisfied expression on his face. Suddenly he uttered an excited yelp, reminiscent of a Pomeranian dog. I rushed to join him. He was standing in the larder in a dramatic attitude. In his hand he was brandishing a leg of mutton. "My dear Poirot," I cried. "Is the matter? Have you suddenly gone mad? Regard, I pray you, this mutton. But regard it closely." I regarded it as closely as I could, but could see nothing unusual about it. It seemed to me a very ordinary leg of mutton. I said as much. Poirot threw me a withering glance. "But do you not see this and this?" and Fluis, he illustrated each this with a jab at the unoffending joint, dislodging small icicles as he did so. Poirot had just accused me of being imaginative, but I now felt that he was far more wildly so than I had ever been. Did he seriously think these slivers of ice were crystals of a deadly poison? That was the only construction I could put upon his extraordinary agitation. "It's frozen meat," I explained gently. "Unvorted, you know. New Zealand." He stared at me for a moment or two and then broke into a strange laugh. "How marvelous is my friend Hastings! He knows everything but everything. How do they say, inquire within upon everything? That is my friend Hastings." He flung down the leg of mutton onto its dish again and left the larder. Then he looked the window. "Here comes our friend the inspector. It is well. I have seen all I want to see here." He drummed on the table absent-mindedly, as though absorbed in calculation, and then asked suddenly, "What is the day of the week, mon ami?" "Monday," I said, rather astonished. Hat. "Ah. Monday, is it? A bad day of the week. To commit a murder on a Monday is a mistake." Passing back to the living room, he tapped the glass on the wall and glanced at the thermometer. Set fair, and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. An orthodox English summer's day. Ingles was still exam_LNG various pieces of Chinese pottery. "You do not take much interest in this inquiry, monsieur," said Poirot. The other gave a slow smile. "It's not my job, you see. I'm a connoisseur of some things, but not of this. So I just stand back and keep out of the way. I've learned patience in the East." The inspector came bustling in, apologizing for having been so long away. He insisted on taking us over most of the ground again, but finally we got away. "I must appreciate your 1,000 politenesses," said Poirot, as we were walking down the village street again. "There is just one more request I should like to put to you. You want to see the body, perhaps, sir?" "Oh, dear me, no. I have not the least interest in the body. I want to see Robert Grant." "You'll have to drive back with me to Moreton to see him, sir." "Very well, I will do so. But I must see him and be able to speak to him alone." The inspector caressed his upper lip. "Well, I don't know about that, sir. I assure you that if you can get to Scotland Yard you will receive full authority. I've heard of you, of course, sir, and I know you've done us a good turn now and again. But it's very irregular." "Nevertheless, it is necessary," said Poirot calmly. "It is necessary for this reason: Grant is not the murderer." "What? Who is, then?" "The murderer was, I should fancy, a youngish man he drove up to Granite Bungalow in a trap, which he left outside. He went in, committed the murder, came out, and drove away again. He was bareheaded, and his clothing was slightly blood-stained. But the whole village would have seen him. Not under certain circumstances. Not if it was dark, perhaps, but the crime was committed in broad daylight." Poirot merely smiled. "And the horse and trap, sir, how could you tell that? Any amount of wheeled vehicles have passed along outside. There's no mark of one in particular to be seen, not with the eyes of the body, perhaps, but with the eyes of the mind, yes." The inspector touched his forehead significantly with a grin at me. I was utterly bewildered, but I had faith in Poirot. Further discussion ended in our all driving back to Moreton with the inspector. Poirot and I were taken to Grant, but a constable was to be present during the interview. Poirot went straight to the point. "Grant, I know you to be innocent of this crime. Relate to me in your own words exactly what happened." The prisoner was a man of medium height, with a somewhat unpleasing cast of features. He looked a jailbird if ever a man did. "Honest to God, I never did it," he whined. "Someone put those little glass figures amongst my traps. It was a frame-up, that's what it was. I went straight to my rooms when I came in, like I said. I never knew a fluing till Betsy screeched out. S'welp me, God, I didn't." Poirot rose. "If you can't tell me the truth, that is the end of it. But, Guv'nor, you did go into the room, you did know your master was dead, and you were just preparing to make a bolt of it when the good Betsy made her terrible discovery." The man stared at Poirot with a dropped jaw. "Come now, is it not so? I tell you solemnly on my word of honor that to be frank now is your only chance." "I'll risk it," said the man suddenly. "It was just as you say. I came in, and went straight to the master, and there he was, dead on the floor and blood all round. Then I got the wind-up proper. They'd ferret out my record, and for a certainty they'd say it was me as had done him in. My only thought was to get away at once before he was found and the jade figures." The man hesitated. "You see you took them by a kind of reversion to instinct, as it were? You had heard your master say that they were valuable, and you felt you might as well go the whole hog. That, I understand. Now, answer me this. Was it the second time that you went into the room that you took the figures?" "I didn't go in a second time. Once was enough for me." "You are sure of that?" "Absolutely certain." "Good. Now, when did you come out of prison?" 2 months ago." "How did you obtain this job?" "Throw at one of them prisoners' help societies. Bloke met me when I came out." "What was he like?" "Not exactly a parson, but looked like one. Soft black hat and mincing way of walking. Got a broken front tooth. Spectacled chapter Saunders his name was. Said he hoped I was repentant, and that he'd find me a good post. I went to old Wally on his recommendation." Poirot rose once more. "I thank you. I know all now. Have patience." He paused in the doorway and added, "Saunders gave you a pair of boots, didn't he?" Grant looked very astonished. "Why, yes, he did. But how did you know?" "It is my business to know dyings," said Poirot gravely. After a word or two to the inspector, the of us went to the White Hart and discussed eels and bacon and Devonshire cider. "Any elucidations yet?" asked Inglace, with a smile. "Yes, the case is clear enough now, but, see you, I shall have a good deal of difficulty in proving it. Wally was killed by order of the Big Four but not by Grant. A very clever man got Grant the post and deliberately planned to make him the scapegoat, an easy matter with Grant's prison record. He gave him a pair of boots, one of 2 duplicate pairs. The other he kept himself. It was all so simple. When Grant is out of the house, and Betsy is chatting in the village, which she probably did every day of her life, he drives up wearing the duplicate boots, enters the kitchen, goes into the living room, fells the old man with a blow, and then cuts his. Then he returns to the kitchen, removes the boots, puts on another pair, and, carrying the first pair, goes out to his trap and drives off again." Inglace looks steadily at Poirot. "There's a catch in it still. Why did nobody see him?" "Ah. That is where the cleverness of number 4, I am convinced, comes. Everybody saw him and yet nobody saw him. You see, he drove up in a butcher's cart." I uttered an exclamation. "The leg of mutton." "Exactly, Hastings, the leg of mutton. Everybody swore that no one had been to Granite Bungalow that morning, but, nevertheless, I found in the larder a leg of mutton, still frozen. It was Monday, so the meat must have been delivered that morning, for if on Saturday, in this hot weather, it would not have remained frozen over Sunday. So someone had been to the bungalow, and a man on whom a trace of blood here and there would attract no attention. Damned ingenious, cried Ingles approvingly. Yes, he is clever, number 4. As clever as Hercule Poirot, I murmured. My friend me a glance of dignified reproach. There are some jests that you should not permit yourself, Hastings, he said sententiously. Have I not saved an innocent man from being sent to the gallows? That is inutile for one day. 5. Disappearance of a scientist. Personally, I don't think that, even when a jury had acquitted Robert Grant, alias Biggs, of the murder of Jonathan Whalley, Inspector Meadows was entirely convinced of his innocence. The case which he had built up against Grant, the man's record, the jade which he had stolen, the boots which fitted the footprints so exactly, was to his matter-of-fact mind too complete to be easily upset, but Poirot, convled much against his inclination to give evidence, convinced the jury. 2 witnesses were produced who had seen a butcher's cart drive up to the bungalow on that Monday morning, and the local butcher testified that his cart only called there on Wednesdays and Fridays. A woman was actually found who, when questioned, remembered seeing the butcher's man leaving the bungalow, but she could furnish no useful description of him. The only impression he seemed to have left on her mind was that he was clean-shaven, of medium height, and looked exactly like a butcher's man. At this description Poirot shrugged his shoulders philosophically. It is as I tell you, Hastings, he said to me, after the trial. He is an artist, this one. He disguises himself not with the false beard and the blue spectacles. He alters his features, yes, but that is the least part. For the time being he is the man he would be. He lives in his part. Certainly I was compelled to admit that the man who had visited us from Hanwell had fitted in exactly with my idea of what an asylum attendant should look like. I should never for a moment have dreamt of doubting that he was genuine. It was all a little discouraging, and our experience on Dartmoor did not seem to have helped us at all. I said as much to Poirot, but he would not admit that we had gained nothing. We progress, he said, we progress. At every contact with this man we learn a little of his mind and his methods. Of us and our plans he knows nothing. And there, Poirot, I protested, he and I seem to be in the same boat. You don't seem to me to have any plans, you seem to sit and wait for him to do something. Poirot smiled. Mon ami, you do not change. Always the same Hastings, who would be up and at their throats. Perhaps, he added, as a knock sounded on the door, you have here your chance, it may be our friend who enters. And he laughed at my disappointment when Inspector Japp and another man entered the room. Good evening, monsieur, said the inspector. Allow me to introduce Captain Kent of the United States Secret Service. Captain Kent was a tall, lean American, with a singularly invasive face which looked as though it had been carved out of wood. Pleased to meet you, gentlemen, he murmured, as he shook hands jerkily. Poirot threw an extra log on the fire, and brought forward more easy chairs. I brought out glasses and the whiskey and soda. The captain took a deep draught, and expressed appreciation. Legislation in your country is still sound, he observed. And now to business, said Japp. Monsieur Poirot here made a certain request to me. He was interested in some concern that went by the name of the Big Four, and he asked me to let him know at any time if I came across a mention of it in my official line of business. I didn't take much stock in the matter, but I remembered what he said, and when the captain here came over with rather a curious story, I said at once, we'll go round to Monsieur Poirot's. Poirot looked across at Captain Kent, and the American took up the tale. You may remember reading, Poirot, that a number of torpedo boats and destroyers were sunk by being dashed upon the rocks off the American coast. It was just after the Japanese earthquake, and the explanation given was that the disaster was the result of a tidal wave. Now, a short time ago, a roundup was made of certain crooks and gunmen, and with them were captured some papers which put an entirely new face upon the matter. They appeared to refer to some organization called the Big Four, and gave an incomplete description of some powerful wireless installation, a concentration of wireless energy far beyond anything so far attempted, and capable of focusing a beam of great intensity upon some given spot. The claims made for this invention seemed manifestly absurd, but I tuned them into headquarters for what they were worth, and one of our highbrow professors got busy on them. Now it appears that one of your British scientists read a paper upon the subject before the British Association. His colleagues didn't think great shakes of it, by all accounts, thought it far-fetched and fanciful, but your scientist stuck to his guns, and declared that he himself was on the eve of success in his experiments. Eh bien, demanded Poirot, with interest. It was suggested that I should come over here and get an interview with this gentleman. Quite a young fellow, he is, Halliday by name. He is the leading authority on the subject, and I was to get from him whether the thing suggested was any way possible. And was it? I asked eagerly. That's just what I don't know. I haven't seen Mr. Halliday and I'm not likely to, by all accounts. The truth of the matter is, said Japp shortly, Halliday's disappeared. When? 2 months ago. Was his disappearance reported? Of course it was. His wife came to us in a great state. We did what we could, but I knew all along it would be no good. Why not? Never is when a man disappears that way. Japp winked. What way? Paris. So Halliday disappeared in Paris. Yes. Went over there on scientific work, so he said. Of course, he'd have to say something like that. But you know what it means when a man disappears over there. Either it's Apache work, and that's the end of it, or else it's voluntary disappearance, and that's a great deal the commoner of the two, I can tell you. Gapery and all that, you know. Sick of home life. Halliday and his wife had had a tiff before he started, which all helps to make it a pretty clear case. I wonder, said Poirot th01 at one tearfully. The American was looking at him curiously. Say, mister, he drawled, what's Fluis Big Four idea? The Big Four, said Poirot, is an international organization which has at its head a Chinaman. He is a Mu and is number 1. Number 2 is an American, number 3 is a Frenchwoman. Number 4, the destroyer, is an Englishman, a Frenchwoman, The American whistled. And Halliday disappeared in France. Maybe there's something in this. Who hates her name? I don't know. I know nothing about her. But it's a RN at LTY big proposition, suggested the other. Poirot nodded, as he arranged the glasses in a neat row on the fray. His love of order was as great as ever. What was the idea in sinking those boats? Are the Big Four a German stunt? The Big Four are for themselves and for themselves only, MLE Capitaine. Their aim is world domination. The American burst out laughing, but broke off at the sight of Poirot's serious face. You laugh at elle, monsieur, said Poirot, shaking a finger at him. You reflect not, you use not the little grey cells of the brain. Who are these men who send a portion of your navy to destruction simply as a trial of their power? For that was all it was, monsieur, a test of this new force of magnetical attraction which they hold. Go on with you, monsieur, said Japp good-humouredly. I've read of super-criminals many a time, but I've never come across them. Well, you've heard Captain Kent's story. Anything further I can do for you? Yes, my good friend. You can give me the address of Mrs. Halliday and also a few words of introduction to her if you will be so kind. Thus it was that the following day saw us bound for Chetwynd Lodge, near the village of Cobham in Surrey. Nears. Halliday received us at once, a tall, fair woman, nervous and eager in manner. With her was her little girl, a beautiful child of 5. Poirot explained the purpose of OU visit. Oh. M. Poirot, I am so glad, so thankful. I have heard of you, of course. You will not be like these Scotland Yard people, who will not listen or try to understand. And the French police are just as bad, worse, I think. They are all convinced that my husband has gone off with some other woman. But he wasn't like that. All he thought of in life was his work. Half our quarrels came from that. He cared for it more than he did for me. Englishmen, they are like that, said Poirot soothingly. And if it is not work, it is the games, the sport. All those things they take au grand sérieux. Now, madam, recount to me exactly, in detail, and as methodically as you can, the exact circumstances of your husband's disappearance. My husband went to Paris on Thursday, the 20th of July. He was to meet and visit various people there connected with his work, amongst them Madame Olivier. Poirot nodded at the mention of the famous French woman chemist, who had eclipsed even Madame Curie in the brilliance of her achievements. She had been decorated by the French government, and was one of the most prominent personalities of the day. He arrived there in the evening and went at once to the Hotel Castiglione in the Rue de Castiglione. On the following morning he had an appointment with Professor Bourguignon, which he kept. His manner was normal and pleasant. The two men had a most interesting conversation, and it was arranged that he should witness some experiments in the professor's laboratory on the following day. He lunched alone at the Café Royal, went for a walk in the Bois, and then visited Madame Olivier at her house at Passy. There, also, his manner was perfectly normal. He left about 6 m. Here he dined is not known, probably alone at some restaurant. He returned to the hotel about 11 o'clock and went straight up to his room. After inquiring if any letters had come for him on the following morning, he walked out of the hotel, and has not been seen again. At what time did he leave the hotel? At the Ho when he would normally leave it to keep his appointment at Professor Bourguignon's laboratory. We do not know. He was not remarked leaving the hotel. But no petit déjeuner was served to him, which seems to indicate that he went out early. Or he might, in fact, have gone out again after he came in the night before. I do not think so. His bed had been slept in, and the night porter would have remembered anyone going out at that hour. A very just observation, madam. We may take it, then, that he left early on the following morning, and that is reassuring from one point of view. He is not likely to have fallen a victim to any Apache assault at that hour. His baggage, now, was it all left behind? Nears. Halliday seemed rather reluctant to answer, but at last she said, "No, he must have taken one small suitcase with him." Said Poirot. Th01 at one tearfully, "I wonder where he was that evening. If we knew that, we should know a great deal. Whom did he meet? There lies the mystery. Madam, myself, I do not of necessity accept the view of the police. With them is it always cherchez la femme. Yet it is clear that something occurred that night to alter your husband's plans. You say he asked for letters on returning to the hotel. Did he receive any? One only, and that must have been the one I wrote him on the day he left England." Poirot remained sunk in thought for a whole minute, then he rose briskly to his feet. "Well, madam, the solution of the mystery lies in Paris, and to find it I myself journey to Paris on the instant. It is all a long time ago, Monsieur Dot." "Yes, yes. Nevertheless, it is there that we must seek." He turned to leave the room, but paused with his hand on the door. "Tell me, madam, do you ever remember your husband mentioning the phrase, Big Four?" "The Big Four," she repeated thoughtfully. "No, I can't say Edo." The sixth woman on the stairs. That was all that could be elicited from Mrs. Halliday. We hurried back to London, and the following day saw us en route for the continent. With rather a rural smile, Poirot observed, "This Big Four, they make me to bestir myself, mon amt. I run up and down, all over the ground, like our old friend the human foxhound." "Perhaps you 11 meet him in Paris," I said, knowing that he referred to a certain Giroux, one of the most trusted detectives of the Sûreté, whom he had met on a previous occasion. Poirot made a grimace. "I devoutly hope not. He loved me not, that one." "Won't it be a very difficult task?" I asked. "To find out what an unknown Englishman did on an evening 2 months ago." "Very difficult, mon ami. But as you know well, difficulties rejoice the heart of Hercule Poirot. You think the Big Fr kidnapped him?" Poirot nodded. Our inquiries necessarily went over old ground, and we learnt little to add to what Mrs. Halliday had already told us. Poirot had a lengthy interview with Professor Bourguignon, during which he sought to elicit whether Halliday had mentioned any plan of his own for the evening, but we drew a complete blank. Our next source of information was the famous Madame Olivier. I was quite excited as we mounted the steps of her villa at Passy. It has always seemed to me extraordinary that a woman should go so far in the scientific world. I should have thought a purely masculine brain was needed for such work. The door was opened by a young lad of 17 or thereabouts, who reminded me vaguely of an acolyte, so ritualistic was his manner. Poirot had taken the trouble to arrange our interview beforehand, as he knew Madame Olivier never received anyone without an appointment, being immersed in research work most of the day. We were shown into a small salon, and presently the mistress of the house came to us there. And Madame Olivier was a very tall woman, her tallness accentuated by the long white overall she wore, and a coif like a nun's that shrouded her head. She had a long pale face, and wonderful dark eyes that burnt with a light almost fanatical. She looked more like a priestess of old than a modern Frenchwoman. One cheek was disfigured by a scar, and I remembered that her husband and co-worker had been killed in an explosion in the laboratory years before, and that she herself had been terribly burned. Ever since then she had shut herself away from the world, and plunged with fiery energy into the work of scientific research. She received us with cold politeness. "I have been interviewed by the police many times, messieurs. I think it hardly likely that I can help you, since I have not been able to help them, madam. It is possible that I shall not ask you quite the same questions. To begin with, of what did you talk together, you and M. Halliday?" She looked a trifle surprised. "But of his work." "His work and also mine. Did he mention to you the theories he had embodied recently in his paper read before the British Association?" "Certainly he did. It was chiefly of those we spoke." "His ideas were somewhat fantastic, were they not?" asked Poirot carelessly. "Some people have thought so. I do not agree." "You consider them practicable?" "Perfectly practicable. My own line of research has been somewhat similar, though not undertaken with the same end in view. I have been investigating the gamma rays emitted by the substance usually known as radium-C, a product of radium emanation, and in doing so I have come across some very interesting magnetical phenomena. Indeed, I have a theory as to the actual nature of the force we call magnetism, but it is not yet time for my discoveries to be given to the world. Near. Halliday's experiments and views were exceedingly interesting to me." Poirot nodded. Then he asked a question which surprised me. "Madam, where did you converse on these topics?" "In here." "No, monsieur. In the laboratory." "May I see it?" "Certainly." She led the way to the door from which she had entered. It opened on a small passage. We passed TLNUF 2 doors and found ourselves in the big laboratory, with its array of beakers and crucibles and 100 appliances of which I did not even know the names. There were 2 occupants, both busy with some experiment. Madame Olivier introduced Mademoiselle Claude, one of my assistants. A tall, serious-faced young girl bowed to us. Monsieur Henry, an old and trusted friend. The young man, short and dark, bowed jerkily. Poirot looked round him. There were 2 other doors besides the one by which we had entered. One, Madame explained, led into the garden, the other into a smaller chamber also devoted to research. Poirot took all the eyes in, then declared himself ready to return to the salon. "Madame, were you alone with M. Halliday during your interview?" "Yes, monsieur. My 2 assistants were in the smaller room next door." "Could your conversation be overheard by them or anyone else?" And Madame reflected, then shook her head. "I do not think so. I am almost sure it could not. The doors were all shut. Could anyone have been concealed in the room? There is the big cupboard in the corner, but the idea is absurd. Pas tout à fait, madame. One thing more, did M. Halliday make any mention of his plans for the evening?" "He said nothing whatever, Monsieur Dot." "I thank you, madame, and I apologize for disturbing you. Pray do not trouble, we can find our way out." We stepped out into the hall. A lady was just entering the front door as we did so. She ran quickly up the stairs, and I was left with an impression of the heavy mourning that denotes a French widow. "A most unusual type of woman, that," remarked Poirot, as we walked away. "Madame Olivier?" "Yes, she mais non, not Madame Olivier." C'est la vie sans dire. There are not many geniuses of her starn in the world. No, I referred to the other lady, the lady on the stairs. I didn't see her face, I said, staring. And I hardly see how you could have done. She never looked at us. That is why I said she was an unusual type, said Poirot placidly. A woman who enters her home, for I presume that it is her home since she enters with a key and runs straight at LT upstairs without even looking at two strange visitors in the hall to see who they are, is a very unusual type of woman, quite unnatural, in fact. Milton airs. What is that? He dragged me back just in time. A tree had crashed down onto the sidewalk, just missing us. Poirot stared at it, pale, and it was a near thing that. But clumsy, all the same, for I had no suspicion, at least hardly any suspicion. Yes, but for my quick eyes, the eyes of a cat, Hercule Poirot might now be crushed out of existence, a terrible calamity for the world. And you, too, Mon, that would not be such a national catastrophe. Thank you, I said coldly. And what are we going to do now? Do, cried Poirot. We are going to Fleuing. Yes, here, and now, we are going to exercise our little grey cells. This Halliday now, was he really in Paris? Yes, for Professor Bourgognot, who knows him, saw and spoke to him. What on earth are you driving at? I cried. That was Friday morning. He was last seen at 11 Friday night, but was he seen then? The porter, an atlet porter who had not previously seen Halliday. A man comes in, sufficiently like Halliday we may trust, number 4 for that, asks for letters, goes upstairs, packs a small suitcase, and slips out the next morning. Nobody saw Halliday all that evening, no, because he was already in the hands of his enemies. Was it Halliday whom Madame Olivier received? Yes, for th01 at 1 she did not emo him by sight. An investor could hardly deceive her on her own special subject. He came here, he had his interview, he left. What happened next? Seizing me by the arm, Poirot was fairly dragging me back to the villa. Now, mon ami, imagine that it is the day after the disappearance, and that we are tracking footprints. You love footprints, do you not? See, here they go, a man's, Halliday's. He turns to the R at LT as we did, he walks briskly other footsteps following behind very quickly, small footsteps, a woman's. See, she catches him up, a slim young woman, in a widow's veil. Pardon, Monsieur, Madame Olivier desires that I recall you. He stops, he turns. Now where would the young woman take him? Is it coincidence that she catches up with him just where a narrow alleyway opens, dividing two gardens? She leads him down it. It is shorter this way, monsieur. On the right is the garden of one Madame Olivier's villa, on the left the garden of another villa, and from that garden, mark you, the tree fell so nearly on us. Garden doors from both open on the alley. The ambush is there. Men pour out, overpower him, and carry him into the strange villa. Good gracious, Poirot, I cried, are you pretending to see all this? I see it with the eyes of the mind, mon amt. So, and only so, could it have happened. Come, let us go back to the house. You want to see Madame Olivier again? Poirot gave a curious smile. No, Hastings, I want to see the face of the lady on the stairs. Who do you think she is, a relation of Madame Olivier's? More probably a secretary, and a secretary engaged not very long ago. The same gentle acolyte opened the door to us. Can you tell me, said Poirot, the name of the lady, the widow lady, who came in just now? Madame Veronneau? Madame's secretary. That is the lady. Would you be so kind as to ask her to speak to us for a moment? The youth disappeared. He soon reappeared. I am sorry. Madame Veronneau must have gone out again. I think not, said Poirot quietly. Will you give her my name, Hercule Poirot, and say that it is important I should see her at once, as I am just going to the prefecture. Again our messenger departed. This time the lady descended. She walked into the salon. We followed her. She turned and raised her veil. To my astonishment I recognized our old antagonist, the Countess Rosikoff, a Russian countess, who had engineered a particularly smart jewel robbery in London. As soon as I caught sight of you in the hall, I feared the worst, she observed plaintively. My dear Countess Rosikoff, she shook her head. Inez Verono now, she murmured. A Spaniard, married to a Frenchman. What do you want of me, M. Poirot? You are a terrible man. You hunted me from London. Now, I suppose, you will tell our wonderful Madame Olivier about me, and hunt me from Paris? We poor Russians, we must live, you know. It is more serious than that, madame, said Poirot, watching her. I propose to enter the villa next door, and release M. Halliday, if he is still alive. I know everything, you see. I saw her sudden pallor. She bit her lip. Then she spoke with her usual decision. He is still alive, but he is not at the villa. Come, monsieur, I will make a bargain with you. Freedom for me and M. Halliday, alive and well, for you I accept, said Poirot. I was about to propose the same bargain myself. By the way, are the Big Four your employers, madam? Again I saw that deathly pallor creep over her face, but she left his question unanswered. Instead, you permit me to telephone, she asked, and crossing to the instrument she rang up a number. The number of the villa, she explained, where our friend is now imprisoned. You may give it to the police. The nest will be empty when they arrive. Ah. I am. Is that you, André? It is I, Inez. The little Belgian knows all. Send Halliday to the hotel, and clear out. She replaced the receiver, and came towards us, smiling. You will accompany us to the hotel, madam? Naturally. I expected that. I got a taxi, and we drove off together. I could see by Poirot's face that he was perplexed. The thing was almost too easy. We arrived at the hotel. The porter came up to us. A gentleman has arrived. He is in your rooms. He seems very ill. A nurse came with him, but she has left. That is all. RLT, said Poirot, he is a friend of mine. We went upstairs together. Sitting in a chair by the window was a haggard young fellow who looked in the last stages of exhaustion. Poirot went over to him. Are you John Halliday? The man nodded. Show me your left arm. John Halliday has a mole just below the left elbow. The man stretched out his arm. The mole was there. Poirot bowed to the Countess. She turned and left the room. A glass of brandy revived Halliday somewhat. My God, he muttered. I have been hell. Those fiends are devils incarnate. My wife, where is she? What does she think? They told me that she would believe. She does not, said Poirot firmly. Her faith in you has never wavered. She is waiting for you, she and the child. Thank God for that. I can hardly believe that I am free once more. Now that you are a little recovered, monsieur, I should like to hear the whole story from the beginning. Halliday looked at him with an indescribable aversion. I remember nothing, he said. Have you ever heard of the Big Four? Something of them, said Poirot dryly. You do not know what I know. They have unlimited power. If I remain silent, I shall be safe. If I say one word, not only I, but my nearest and dearest will suffer unspeakable things. It is no good arguing with me. I know. I remember nothing. And, getting up, he walked from the room. Poirot's face wore a baimed expression. So it is like that, is it? He muttered. The Big Four win again. What is that you are holding in your hand, Hastings? I handed it to him. The Countess scribbled it before she left, i.e. flamed. He read it. Au revoir. IV. Signed with her initials I.V. Just a coincidence, perhaps, that they also stand for four. I wonder, Hastings, I wonder. 7. The radium thieves. On the NLT of his release, Halliday slept in the room next to ours at the hotel, and all night long I heard him moaning and protesting in his sleep. Undoubtedly his experience in the villa had broken his nerve, and in the morning we failed conveniently to extract any information from him. He would only repeat his statement about the unlimited power at the disposal of the Big Four, and his assurance of the vengeance which would follow if he talked. After lunch he departed to rejoin his wife in England, but Poirot and I remained behind in Paris. I was all for energetic proceedings of some kind or other, and Poirot's quiescence annoyed me. For heaven's sake, Poirot, I urged, let us be up and at them. Admirable, mon ami, admirable. Up where, and at whom? Be precise, I beg of you. At the Big Four, of course. C'est la vie sans dire. But how would you set about it? The police, I hazarded doubtfully. Poirot smiled. They would accuse us of romancing. We have nothing to go upon, nothing whatever. We must wait. Wait for what? Wait for them to make a move. See now, in England you all comprehend and adore la boxe. If one man does not make a move, the other must, and by permitting the adversary to make the attack one learns something about him. That is our part, to let the other side make the attack. You think they will? I said doubtfully. I have no doubt whatever of it. To begin with, see, they try to get me out of England. That fails. Then, in the Dartmoor affair, we step in and save their victim from the gallows. And yesterday, once again, we interfere with their plans. Assuredly, they will not leave the matter there. As I reflected on Diaz, there was a knock on the door. Without waiting for a reply, a man stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He was a tall, thin man, with a slightly hooked nose and a sallow convolution. He wore an overcoat buttoned up to his chin, and a soft hat well pulled down over his eyes. "Excuse me, gentlemen, for my somewhat unceremonious entry," he said in a soft voice, "but my business is of a rather unorthodox nature." Smiling, he advanced to the table and sat down by it. I was about to spring up, but Poirot restrained me with a gesture. "As you say, monsieur, your entry is somewhat unceremonious. Will you kindly state your business?" "My dear M. Poirot, it is very simple. You have been annoying my friends." "In what way?" Come, M. Poirot. You do not seriously ask me that? You know as well as I do. It depends, monsieur, upon who these friends of yours are." Without a word, the man drew from his pocket a cigarette case, and, opening it, took out 4 cigarettes and tossed them on the table. Then he picked them up and returned them to his case, which he replaced in his pocket. "Aha," said Poirot, "so it is like that, is it? And what do your friends suggest?" "They suggest, monsieur, that you should employ your talents, your very considerable talents, in the detection of legitimate crime, return to your former avocations, and solve the problems of London society ladies." "A peaceful program," said Poirot. "And I do not agree." The man made an eloquent gesture. "We should regret it, of course, exceedingly," he said. "So would all the friends and admirers of the great M. Hercule Poirot. But regrets, however poignant, do not bring a man to life again." "Put very delicately," said Poirot, nodding his head. "And supposing I accept? In that case I am empowered to offer you compensation." He drew out a pocket-book, and 10 notes on the table. They were for 10,000 francs each. "That is merely a guarantee of our good fate, he said. 10 times that amount will be paid you." "Good God," I cried, springing. "You dare to think—" "Sit down, Hastings," said Poirot autocratically. "Subdue your so beautiful and honest nature and sit down. To you, monsieur, I will say this. What is to prevent me ringing up the police and giving you into their custody, whilst my friend here prevents you from escaping?" "By all means do so if you think it advisable," said our visitor calmly. "Oh! Look here, Poirot," I cried. "I can't stand this. Ring up the police and have done with it." Rising swiftly, I strode to the door and stood with my back against it. "It seems the obvious course," murmured Poirot, as though debating with himself. "But you distrust the obvious, said our visitor, smiling. "Go on, Poirot," I urged. "It will be your responsibility, mon ami." As he lifted the receiver, the man made a sudden, cat-like jump at me. I was ready for him in another minute. We were locked together. Staggering round the room, suddenly I felt him slip and falter. I pressed my advantage. He went down before me. And then, in the very flush of victory, an extraordinary thing happened. I felt myself flying forwards. Head first, I crashed into the wall in a complicated heap. I was up in a minute, but the door was already closing behind my late adversary. I rushed to it and shook it. It was locked on the outside. I seized the telephone from Poirot. "Is that the bureau? Stop a man who is coming out." A tall man, with a buttoned-up overcoat and a soft hat. "He is wanted by the police." Very few minutes elapsed before we heard a noise in the corridor outside. The key was turned and the door flung open. The manager himself stood in the doorway. "The man, you have got him?" I cried. "No, monsieur. No one has descended. You must have passed him." "We have passed no one, monsieur. It is incredible that he can have escaped." "You have passed someone, I think," said Poirot, in his gentle voice. "One of the hotel staff, perhaps." "Only a waiter carrying a tray, monsieur Dot." "Ah," said Poirot, in a tone that spoke infinities. "So that was why he wore his overcoat buttoned up to his cheveux," mused Poirot, when we had finally got rid of the excited hotel officials. "I'm awfully sorry, Poirot," I murmured, rather crestfallen. "I thought I'd downed him all right." "Yes, that was a Japanese trick, I fancy. Do not distress yourself, mon ami. All went according to plan. His plan. That is what I wanted." "What's this?" I cried, pouncing on a brown object that lay on the floor. It was a slim pocket-book of Bruin leather, and had evidently fallen from our visitor's pocket during his struggle with me. It contained 2 receipt bills in the name of M. Felix Lawn, and a folded-up piece of paper which made my heart beat faster. It was a half-sheet of note paper on which a few words were scrawled in pencil, but they were words of supreme importance. "The next meeting of the council will be on Friday at 34 Rue des Echelles at 11 a.m. It was signed with a big figure 4. And today was Friday, and the clock on the mantelpiece showed the hour to be 10:30. My God, what a chance!" I cried. "Fate is playing into our hands. We must start at once, though. What stupendous luck!" "So that was why he came," murmured Poirot. "I see it all now." "See what?" "Come on, Poirot, don't stay daydreaming there." Poirot looked at me, and slowly shook his head, smiling as he did so. "Will you walk into my parlor?" said the spider to the fly. "That is your little English nursery rhyme, is it not?" "No, no, they are subtle, but not so subtle as Hercule Poirot." "What on earth are you driving at, Poirot?" "My friend, I have been asking myself the reason of this morning's visit. Did our visitor really hope to succeed in bribing me? Or, alternatively, in frightening me into abandoning my task? It seemed hardly credible. Why, then, did he come? And now I see the whole plan, very neat, very pretty, the ostensible reason to bribe or frighten me, the necessary strudel which he took no pains to avoid, and which should make the dropped pocket-book natural and reasonable, and finally the pitfall. Rue des Echelles, 11 a.m. I think not, mon ami. One does not catch Hercule Poirot as easily as that." "Good heavens," I gasped. Poirot was frowning to himself. "There is still one thing I do not understand." "What is that?" "The time, Hastings, the time. If they wanted to decoy me away, surely nighttime would be better? Why this early hour? Is it possible that something is about to happen this morning? Something which the Aramis Hercule Poirot should not know about?" He shook his head. "We shall see. Here I sit, mon ami. We do not stir out this morning. We await events here." It was at 11:30 exactly that the summons came. A petit bleu. Poirot tore it open, then handed it to me. It was from Madame Olivier, the world-famous scientist, whom we had visited yesterday in connection with the Halliday case. It asked us to come out to Passy at once. We obeyed the summons without an instant's delay. Madame Olivier received us in the same small salon. I was struck anew with the wonderful power of this woman, with her long nun's face and burning eyes, this brilliant successor of Becquerel and the Curies. She came to the point at once. "Messieurs, you interviewed me yesterday about the disappearance of M. Halliday. I now learn that you returned to the house a second time, and asked to see my secretary, Inez Verono. She left the house with you, and has not returned here since. Is that all, madam? No, monsieur, it is not. Last night the laboratory was broken into, and several valuable papers and memoranda were stolen. The thieves had a cry for something more precious still, but luckily they failed to open the big safe. Madam, these are the facts of the case. Your late secretary, Madame Verono, was really the Countess Rosikoff, an expert thief, and it was she who was responsible for the disappearance of M. Halliday. How long had she been with you? 5 months, monsieur. You say amazes me. It is true, nevertheless. These papers, were they easy to find? Or do you think an insidemolage was shown? It is rather curious that the thieves knew exactly where to look. You think Inez? Yes, I have no doubt that it was upon her information that they acted. But what is this precious thing that the thieves failed to find? Jewels. And Madame Olivier shook her head with a faint smile. Something much more precious than that, Monsieur Dot. She looked round her, then bent forward, lowering her voice. Radium, Monsieur Dot. Radium. Yes, monsieur. I am now at the CRTX off-me experiments. I possess a small portion of radium myself. More has been lent to me for the process I am at work upon. Small though the actual quantity is, it comprises a large amount of the world's stock and represents a value of millions of francs. And where is it? In its leaden case in the big safe. The safe purposely appears to be of an old and worn-out pattern, but it is really a triumph of the safe maker's art. That is probably why the thieves were unable to open it. How long are you keeping this radium in your possession? Only for 2 days more, monsieur. Then my experiments will be concluded. Poirot's eyes brightened. And Inez Verono is aware of the fact? Good, then our friends will come back. Not a word of me to anyone, madam. But rest assured, I will save your radium for you. You have a key of the door leading from the laboratory to the garden. Yes, monsieur. Here it is. I have a for myself. And here is the key of the garden door leading out into the alleyway between this villa and the next one. I thank you, madam. Go to bed as usual, have no fears, and leave all to me. But not a word to anyone, not to your 2 assistants, Mademoiselle Claude and Monsieur Henry, is it not? Particularly not a word to them. Poirot left the villa rubbing his hands in great satisfaction. What are we going to do now? I asked. Now, Hastings, we are about to leave Paris for England. We will pack our effects, have lunch, and drive to the Gare du Nord. But the radium. I said we were going to leave for England. I did not say we were going to arrive there. Reflect a moment, Hastings. It is quite certain that we are being watched and followed. Our enemies must believe that we are going back to England, and they certainly will not believe that unless they see us get on board the train and start. Do you mean we are to slip off again at the last minute? No, Hastings. Our enemies will be satisfied with nothing less than a bona fide departure. But the train doesn't stop until Calais. It will stop if it is paid to do so. Oh, come now, Poirot, surely you can't pay in to stop the rails. My dear friend, have you never remarked the little handle, the signal d'arrêt penalty for improper use, 100 francs, I flunk. Oh. You are going to pull that. Or rather a friend of mine, Pierre Camillo, will do so. Then, while he is arguing with the guard, and making a big scene, and all the train is agog with interest, you and I will fade quietly away. We duly carried out Poirot's plan. Pierre Camillo, an old crony of Poirot's, and who evidently knew my little friend's methods pretty well, fell in with the arrangements. The communication cord was pulled just as we got to the outskirts of Paris. Camillo made a scene in the most approved French fashion, and Poirot and I were able to leave the train without anyone being interested in our departure. Our first proceeding was to make a considerable change in our appearance. Poirot had brought the materials for this with him in a small case. 2 loafers in dirty blue blouses were the result. We had dinner in an obscure hostelry, and started back to Paris afterwards. It was close on 11 o'clock when we found ourselves once more in the neighborhood of Madame Oliver's villa. We looked up and down the road before slipping into the alleyway. The whole place appeared to be perfectly deserted. One thing we could be quite certain of, no one was following us. "I do not expect them to be here yet," whispered Poirot to me. "Possibly they may not come until tomorrow night, but they know perfectly well that there are only 2 nights on which the radium will be there." Very cautiously we turned the key in the garden door. It opened noiselessly and we stepped into the garden. And then, with complete unexpectedness, the blow fell. In a minute we were surrounded, gagged, and bound. At least 10 men must have been waiting for us. Resistance was useless. Like 2 helpless bundles we were lifted up and carried along. To my intense astonishment, they took us towards the house and not away from it. With a key they opened the door into the laboratory and carried us into it. One of the men stooped down before a big safe. The door of it swung open. I felt an unpleasant sensation down my spine. Were they going to bundle us into it, and leave us there to asphyxiate slowly? However, to my amazement, I saw that from the inside of the safe steps led down beneath the floor. We were thrust down this narrow way and eventually came out into a big subterranean chamber. A woman stood there, tall and imposing, with a black velvet mask covering her face. She was clearly in command of the situation by her gestures of authority. The men slung us down on the floor and left us alone with the mysterious creature in the mask. I had no doubt who she was. This was the unknown Frenchwoman number 3 of the Big Four. She knelt down beside us and removed the gags, but left us bound. Then rising, and facing us, with a sudden swift gesture she removed her mask. It was Madame Olivier. "M. Poirot," she said, in a low mocking tone. "The great, the wonder-all, the unique, M. Poirot. I sent a warning to you yesterday morning. You chose to disregard it. You thought you could pit your wits against us. And now, you are here." There was a cold Molly goodnighty about her that froze me to the marrow. It was so at variance with the burning fire of her eyes. She was mad with the madness of genius. Poirot said nothing. His jaw had dropped, and he was staring at her. "Well," she said softly, "this is the end. We cannot permit our plans to be interfered with. Have you any last request to make? Never before, or since, have I felt so near death." Poirot was magnificent. He neither flinched nor paled, just stared at her with unabated interest. "Your psychology interests me enormously, madam," he said quietly. "It is a pity that I have so short a time to devote to studying it. Yes, I have a request to make. A condemned man is always allowed a last smoke, I believe. I have my cigarette case on me. If you would permit." He looked down at his bonds. "Oh, yes," she laughed. "You would like me to untie your hands, would you not? You are clever, M. Hercule Poirot, I know that. I shall not untie your hands, but I will find you a cigarette." She knelt down by him, extracted his cigarette case, took out a cigarette, and placed it between his lips. "And now a match," she said, rising. "It is not necessary, madam." Something in his voice startled me. She, too, was arrested. "Do not move, I pray of you, madam. You will regret it if I do. Are you acquainted at all with the properties of curare? The South American Indians use it as an arrow poison. A scratch with it means death. Some tribes use a little blowpipe, too, have a little blowpipe constructed so as to look exactly like a cigarette. I have only to blow. All. You start. Do not move, madam. The mechanism of this cigarette is most ingenious. One blows and a tiny dart resembling a fishbone flies the air to find its mark. You do not wish to die, madam. Therefore, I beg of you to release my friend Hastings from his bonds. Cannot use my hands, but I can turn my head so you are still covered, madam. Make no mistake, I beg of you." Slowly, with shaking hands, and rage and hate convulsing her face, she bent down and did his bidding. I was free. Poirot's voice gave me instructions. "Your bonds will now do for the lady, Hastings." "That is right." Is she securely fastened? Then release me, I pray of you. It is a fortunate circumstance she sent away her henchmen. With a little luck we may hope to find the way out unobstructed. In another minute, Poirot stood by my side. He bowed to the lady. Hercule Poirot is not killed so easily, madam. I wish you good night. The gag prevented her from replying, but the murderous gleam in her eyes frightened me. I hoped devoutly that we should never fall into her again. 3 minutes later we were outside the villa, and hurriedly traversing the garden. The road outside was deserted, and we were soon clear of the neighborhood. Then Poirot broke out. I deserve all that that woman said to me. I am a triple imbecile, a miserable animal, 36 times an idiot. I was proud of Miguelfeur not falling into their trap. And it was not even meant as a trap except exactly in the way in which I fell into it. They knew I would see it. They counted on my seeing it. This explains all the ease with which they surrendered. Halliday everything. Madame Olivier was the ruling spirit, Vera Rosikoff only her lieutenant. Madame needs Halliday's ideas. She herself had the necessary genius to supply the gaps that perplexed him. Yes, Hastings, we know now who number 3 is, the woman who is probably the greatest scientist in the world. Think of it. The brain of the East, the science of the West, and 2 others whose identities we do not yet know. But we must find out. Tomorrow we will return to London and set about it. You are not going to denounce Madame Olivier to the police. I should not be believed. The woman is one of the idols of France. And we can prove nothing. We are lucky if she does not denounce us. Think of it. We are found at night upon the premises with keys in our possession which she will swear she never gave us. She surprises us at the safe, and we gag and bind her and make away. Have no illusions, Hastings. The boot is not upon the right leg. Is that how you say it? In the house of the enemy, after our adventure in the villa at Passy, we returned post-haste to London. Several letters were awaiting Poirot. He read one of them with a curious smile, and then handed it to me. Read this, mon ami. I turned first to the signature, Abe Ryland, and recalled Poirot's words, the richest man in the world. Near. Ryland's letter was curt and incisive. He expressed himself as profoundly dissatisfied with the reason Poirot had given for withdrawing from the South American proposition at the last moment. This gives one furiously to think, does it not? Said Poirot. I suppose it's only natural he should be a bit ratty. No, no, you comprehend not. Remember the words of Mayerling, the man who took refuge here only to die by the hands of his enemies. Number 2 is represented by an S with 2 lines at the sign of $1, also by 2 stripes and a star. It may be conjectured therefore that he is an American subject, and that he represents the power of wealth. Add to those words the fact that Ryland offered me a huge sum to tempt me out of England, and what about it, Hastings? You mean, I said, staring, that you suspect Abe Ryland, the multimillionaire, of being number 2 of the Big Four? Your BR@LT intellect has grasped the idea, Hastings. Yes, I do. The tone in which you said multimillionaire was eloquent, but let me impress upon you one fact: this thing is being run by men at the top and near. Ryland has the reputation of being no beauty in his business dealings. An able, unscrupulous man, a man who has all the wealth that he needs, and is out for unlimited power. There was undoubtedly something to be said for Poirot's view. I asked him when he had made up his mind definitely upon the point. That is just it. I am not sure. I cannot be sure. Mon ami, I would give anything to know. Let me but place number 2 definitely as Abe Ryland, and we draw nearer to our goal. He has just arrived in London, I see by Fluis, I said, tapping the letter. Shall you call upon him, and make your apologies in person? I might do so. 2 days later, Poirot returned to our rooms in a state of boundless excitement. He grasped me by both hands in his most impulsive manner. My friend, an occasion stupendous, unprecedented, never to be repeated, has presented itself. Lo, but there is danger, grave danger. I should not even ask you to attempt it. If Poirot was trying to frighten me, he was going the wrong way to work, and so I told him, becoming less incoherent. he unfolded his plan. It seemed that Ryland was looking for an English secretary, one with a good social manner and presence. It was Poirot's suggestion that I should apply for the post. I would do it, myself, mon ami, he explained apologetically. But, see you, it is almost impossible for me to disguise myself in the needful manner. I speak the English very well except when I am excited, but hardly so as to deceive the ear, and even though I were to sacrifice my mustaches, I doubt not but that I should still be recognizable as Hercule Poirot. I doubted it also, and declared myself ready and willing to take up the part and penetrate into Ryland's household. 10 to 1 he won't engage me anyway, I remarked. Oh, yes, he will. I will arrange for you such testimonials as shall make him lick his lips. The Home Secretary himself shall recommend you. This seemed to be carrying things a bit far, but Poirot waved aside my remonstrances. Oh, yes, he will do it. I investigated for him a little matter which might have caused a grave scandal. All was solved with discretion and delicacy, and now, as you would say, he perches upon my hand like the little bird and pecks the crumbs. Our first step was to engage the services of an artist in makeup. He was a little man, with a quaint bird-like turn of the head, not unlike Poirot's own. He considered me some time in silence, and then fell to work. When I looked at myself in the glass half an hour afterwards, I was amazed. Special shoes caused me to stand at least 2 inches taller, and the coat I wore was arranged so as to give me a long, lank, weedy look. My eyebrows had been cunningly altered, giving a totally different expression to my face. I wore pads in my cheeks, and the deep tan of my face was a thing of the past. My mustache had gone, and a gold tooth was prominent on one side of my mouth. Your name, said Poirot, is Arthur Neville. God guard you, my friend, for I fear that you go into perilous places. It was with a beating heart that I presented myself at the Savoy, at an hour named by Mr. Ryland, and asked to see the great man. After being kept waiting a minute or two, I was shown upstairs to his suite. Ryland was sitting at a table. Spread out in front of him was a letter which I could see out of the tail of my eye was in the Home Secretary's handwriting. It was my first sight of the American millionaire, and, in spite of myself, I was impressed. He was tall and lean, with a jutting out chin and slightly hooked nose. His eyes glittered cold and gray behind penthouse brows. He had thick grizzled hair, and a long black cigar, without which, I learned later, he was never seen, protruded rakishly from the corner of his mouth. Sit down, he grunted. I sat. He tapped the letter in front of him. According to this piece here, you're the goods all right, and I don't need to look further. Say, are you well up in the social matters? I said that I thought I could satisfy him in that respect. I mean to say, if I have a lot of dukes and earls and viscounts and such like down to the country place I've gotten, you'll be able to sort them out all right and put them where they should be round the dining table. Oh, quite easily, I replied, smiling. We exchanged a few more preliminaries, and then I found myself engaged. What Mr. Ryland wanted was a secretary conversant with English society, as he already had an American secretary and a stenographer with him. 2 days later I went down to Hatton Chase, the seat of the Duke of Loamshire, which the American millionaire had rented for a period of 6 months. My duties gave me no difficulty whatever. At one period of my life I had been private secretary to a busy member of Parliament, so I was not called upon to assume a role unfamiliar to me. Mr. Ryland usually entertained a large party over the weekend, but the middle of the week was comparatively quiet. I saw very little of Mr. Appleby, the American secretary, but he seemed a pleasant, normal young American, very efficient in his work. Of Endless Martin, the stenographer, I saw rather more. She was a pretty girl of about 23 or 4, with auburn hair and brown eyes that could look mischievous enough upon occasion, though they were usually cast demurely down. I had an idea that she both disliked and distrusted her employer, though, of course, she was careful never to hint at anything of the kind, but the time came when I was unexpectedly taken into her confidence. I had, of course, carefully scrutinized all the members of the household. 1 or 2 of the servants had been newly engaged, one of the footmen, I think, and some of the housemaids. The butler, the housekeeper, and the chef were the Duke's own staff, who had consented to remain on in the establishment. The housemaids I dismissed as unimportant. I scrutinized James, the second footman, very carefully, but it was clear that he was an underfootman and an underfootman only. He had, indeed, been engaged by the butler. A person of whom I was far more suspicious was Deeves, Ryland's valet, whom he had brought over from New York with him, an Englishman by birth, with an irreproachable manner. I yet harbored vague suspicions about him. I had been at Hatton Chase weeks, and not an incident of any kind had arisen which I could lay my finger on in support of our theory. There was no trace of the activities of the Big Four. Mr. Ryland was a man of overpowering force and personality, but I was coming to believe that Poirot had made a mistake when he associated him with that dread organization. I even heard him mention Poirot in a casual way at dinner one night. "Wonderful little man," they say. "But he's a quitter." How do I know? I put him on a deal, and he turned me down the last minute. I'm not taking any more if I owe you or Monsieur Hercule Poirot. It was at moments such as these that I felt my cheek pads most wearisome. And then Miss Martin told me a rather curious story. Ryland had gone to London for the day, taking Appleby with him. Miss Martin and I were strolling together in the garden after tea. I liked the girl very much. She was so unaffected and so natural. I could see that there was something on her mind, and at last out it came. "Do UK10W, Major Neville," she said. "I am really thinking of resigning my post here." I looked somewhat astonished, and she went on hurriedly. "Oh, it's a wonderful job to have got, in a way. I suppose most people would think me a fool to it up. But I can't stand abuse, Major Neville. To be sworn at like a trooper is more than I can bear. No gentleman would do such a thing. Has Ryland been swearing at you?" She nodded. "Of course, he's always rather irritable and short-tempered. That one expects. It's all in the day's work. But to fly into such an absolute fry over nothing at all. He really looked as though he could have murdered me. And, as I say, over nothing at all. Tell me about it," I said, keenly interested. As UK10W, I open all Mr. Ryland's letters. Some I hand on to Mr. Appleby, others I deal with myself, but I do all the preliminary sorting. Now there are certain letters that come, written on blue paper, and with a tiny 4 marked on the corner. "I beg your pardon, did you speak?" I had been unable to repress a stifled exclamation, but I hurriedly shook my head, and bade her to continue. "Well, as I was saying, these letters come, and there are strict orders that they are never to be opened, but to be handed over to Mr. Ryland intact. And, of course, I always do so. But there was an unusually heavy mail yesterday morning, and I was opening these letters in a terrific hurry. By mistake I opened one of these letters. As soon as I saw what I had done, I took it to Mr. Ryland and explained. To my utter amazement he flew into the most awful rage. As I tell you, I was quite frightened. What was there in the letter, I wonder, to him so? Absolutely nothing. That's just the curious part of it. I had read it before I discovered my mistake. It was quite short. I can still remember it word for word, and there was nothing in it that could possibly upset anyone. You can repeat it, you say? I encouraged her. Yes. She paused a minute and then repeated slowly, whilst I noted down the words unobtrusively, the following: "Dear sir, the essential thing now, I should say, is to see the property. If you insist on the quarry being included, then 17,000 seems reasonable. 11% or commission too much, 4% is ample. Yours truly, Arthur Leversham." Miss Martin went on, evidently about some property Mr. Ryland was thinking of buying. "But really, I do feel that a man who can get into a rage over such a trifle is, well, dangerous. What do you think I owe you at LT to do, Major Neville? You've more experience of the world than I have." I soothed the girl down, pointed out to her that Mr. Ryland had probably been suffering from the enemy of his race, dyspepsia. In the end I sent her away quite comforted. But I was not so easily satisfied myself. When the girl had gone, and I was alone, I took out my notebook, and ran over the letter which I had jotted down. What did it mean, this apparently innocent-sounding missive? Did it concern some business deal which Ryland was undertaking, and was he amiss that no details about it should leak out until it was carried? That was a possible explanation. But I remembered the small figure 4 with which the envelopes were marked, and I felt that, at last, I was on the track of the thing we were seeking. I puzzled over the letter all that evening, and most of the next day, and then suddenly the solution came to me. It was so simple, too. The figure 4 was the clue. Read every fourth word in the letter, and an entirely different message appeared. Essential should see you quarry 1711-4. The solution of the figures was easy. 17 stood for the 17th of October, which was tomorrow, 11 was the time, and 4 was the signature, either referring to the mysterious number 4 himself, or else it was the trademark, so to speak, of the Big Four. The quarry was also intelligible. There was a big disused quarry on the estate about half a mile from the house, a lonely spot, ideal for a secret meeting. For a moment or two I was tempted to run the show myself. It would be such a feather in my cap, for once, to have the pleasure of crowing over Poirot. But in the end I overcame the temptation. This was a big business. I had no right to play a lone hand, and perhaps jeopardize our chances of success. For the first time, we had stolen a march upon our enemies. We must make good this time, and, disguise the fact as I might, Poirot had the better brain of the two. I wrote off post-haste to him, laying the facts before him, and explaining how urgent it was that we should overhear what went on at the interview. If he liked to leave it to me, well and good, but I gave him detailed instructions how to reach the quarry from the station in case he should deem it wise to be present himself. I took the letter down to the village and posted it myself. I had been able to communicate with Poirot my stay, but we agreed that he should not attempt to communicate with me in case my letters should be tampered with. I was in a glow of excitement the following evening. No guests were staying in the house, and I was busy with Ryland in his study all the evening. I had foreseen that this would be the case, which was why I had no hope of being able to meet Poirot at the station. I was, however, confident that I would be dismissed well before 11 o'clock. Sure enough, just after 10:30, Mr. Ryland glanced at the clock, and announced that he was through at L. I took the hint and retired discreetly. I went upstairs as though going tobbed, but slipped quietly down a side staircase and let myself out into the garden, having taken the precaution to don a dark overcoat to hide my white shirt front. I had gone some way down the garden when I chanced to look over my shoulder. Mr. Ryland was just stepping out from his study window into the garden. He was starting to keep the appointment. I redoubled my pace, so as to get a clear start. I arrived at the quarry somewhat out of breath. There seemed no one about, and I crawled into a thick tangle of bushes and awaited developments. 10 minutes later, just on the stroke of 11, Ryland stalked up, his hat over his eyes and the inevitable cigar in his mouth. He gave a quick look round, and then plunged into the hollows of the quarry below. Presently I heard a low murmur of voices come up to me. Evidently the other man or men, whoever they were, had arrived first at the rendezvous. I crawled cautiously out of the bushes, and inch by inch, using the utmost precaution against noise, I wormed myself down the steep path. Only a boulder now separated me from the talking men. Secure in the blackness, I peeped round the edge of it and found myself facing the muzzle of a black, murderous-looking automatic. "Hands up," said Ryland succinctly. "I've been waiting for you." He was seated in the shadow of the rock, so that I could not see his face, but the menace in his voice was unpleasant. Then I felt a ring of cold steel on the back of my neck, and Ryland lowered his own automatic. "That SR at LT, George," he drawled. "March him around here." Raging inwardly, I was conducted to a spot in the shadows, where the unseen George, whom I suspected of being the impeccable Deves, gagged and bound me securely. Ryland spoke again in a tone which I had difficulty in recognizing, so cold and menacing was it. "This is going to be the end of you two. You've got in the way of the Big Four once too often. Ever heard of landslides? There was one about here 2 years ago. There's going to be another. I've fixed that good and square. Say, that friend of yours doesn't keep his dates very punctually. A wave of horror swept over me. Poirot. In another minute he would walk straight into the trap. And I was powerless to warn him. I could only pray that he had elected to leave the matter in my hands, and had remained in London. Surely, if he had been coming, he would have been here by now. With every minute that passed, my hopes rose. Suddenly they were dashed to pieces. I heard footsteps, cautious footsteps, but footsteps nevertheless. I tithed in impotent agony. They came down the path, paused, and then Poirot himself appeared, his head a little on one side, peering into the shadows. I heard the growl of satisfaction Ryland gave as he raised the big automatic and shouted, "Hands up!" Deves sprang forward as he did so, and took Poirot in the rear. The ambush was complete. "Pleased to meet you, near Hercule Poirot," said the American grimly. Poirot's self-possession was marvelous. He did not turn a hair. But I saw his eyes searching in the shadows. "My friend. He is here." "Yes, you are both in the trap of the Big Four." He led. "A trap?" queried Poirot. "Say, haven't you tumbled to it yet?" "I comprehend that there is a trap, yes," said Poirot gently. "But you are in error, monsieur. It is you who are in it, not I and my friend." "What?" Ryland raised the big automatic, but I saw his gaze falter. "Fire, you commit murder watched by 10 pairs of eyes, and you will be hanged for it. This place is surrounded, has been for the last hour, by Scotland Yard men. It is checkmate, Mr. Abe Ryland." He uttered a curious whistle, and, as though by magic, the place was alive with men. They seized Ryland and the valet and disarmed them. After speaking a few words to the officer in charge, Poirot took me by the arm, and led me away. Once clear of the quarry he embraced me with vigor. "You are alive, you are unhurt. It is magnificent. Often have I blamed myself for letting you go." "I'm perfectly all right," I said, disengaging myself. "But I'm just a bit fogged." "You tumbled to their little scheme, did you?" "But I was waiting for it. For what else did I permit you to go there? Your false name, your disguise, not for a moment was it intended to deceive." "What?" I cried. "You never told me. As I have frequently told you, Hastings, you have a nature so beautiful and so honest that unless you are yourself deceived, it is impossible for you to deceive others." "Good, then, you are spotted from the first, and they do what I had counted on their doing. A mathematical certainty to anyone who uses his gray cells properly. Use you as a decoy. They set the girl on, by the way, mon ami, as an interesting fact psychologically. Had she got red hair?" "If you mean Miss N. Lardon," I said coldly. "Her hair is a delicate shade of auburn, but, they are epidants, these people. They have even studied your psychology." "Oh. Yes, my friend, Miss Martin was in the plot, very much so. She repeats the letter to you, together with her tale of Mr. Ryland's wrath. You write it down, you puzzle your brains. The cipher is nicely arranged, difficult, but not too difficult. You solve it, and you send for. But what they do not know is that I am waiting for just this very thing to happen. I go